Thanks, Liz. And thanks everybody for coming in this morning. Really excited to have such a good audience here. What I want to talk about this this subject today is we're going to keep it fairly high level, right? So if you have questions or you want a little deeper analysis, I can send you some information, from Microsoft Docs and things like that. Reach out to me. My email is csaferlis@pragmaticworks.com, and then also through Twitter and LinkedIn down the bottom there. But happy to have the conversation and drill in a little bit and figure out why you don't have confidence in your DR plan, or your business continuity plan, and what steps we can take to help alleviate some of that. But as we kick it off, right, you can see that going by the numbers, 18%. Immature planning, limited testing, compliance, business needs, right? This is from a Forrester survey. 18% of global disaster-ready recovery decision makers and influencers feel prepared, right? That's actually a little higher than the number that we saw. And then what are they saying? Why are they having these problems? Immature planning and limited testing. But really, we create this DR plan. I was a CIO for a long time, and it was a constant battle, right? Because you're adding new services, new servers, new software, new team members, new sites through mergers and acquisitions, and you're constantly needing to update your DR plan, and it really is a battle. So rather than trying to build up this complete plan that includes all of your various iterations of software and hardware and all that, let's think about more of a templated approach where when we bring a new site online or we bring a new server online, how do we add that into the fold rather than having to go back and completely redesign and re-update? Or let's build a plan from the beginning that can handle all of our requirements as a business. And then when we talk about, what is the need for this DR plan, right? When we talk about regulatory compliance, and really keeping the business online, because that's our ultimate goal, is keeping the business online and making sure that orders can ship, customers can be responded to, whatever that is, but let's keep the lights on, right? And when we talked about, in the survey question, you guys had it pretty much spot on, right? Is that number one was system failures. We apply the wrong patch, or, in certain cases, we've seen that a whole site's taken offline for hours and hours because, the wrong line of code was executed on a router or a server or a cluster or whatever, and then you've got the power failure, right? So this kind of goes without saying, if you don't have everything you need in the way of redundancy and resilience, power failures are going to get you. And then we've got natural disasters. These are definitely on the lower side than a lot of people think. Generally, this is where people get tripped up, is that they're planning for natural disasters, but the reality is, there are obviously other issues that are bigger. And then, of course, you've got the cyber attacks, right? DDoS attacks and things like that, people are really subject to. And, all you can do is make your best effort to make sure that doesn't happen. But, as they say, you lock the gate, and your gate's only as secure as the lock you put on it. You put a bigger lock, they're just going to find a bigger set of bolt cutters, right? So what are the challenges in implementing disaster recovery, right? You've got a constantly changing landscape, right? But cost is a big one. What does it cost to have a secondary site? What does it cost to have a secondary set of resources? What does it cost to buy the software? What does it cost to implement this plan and continually maintain it, right? How difficult is it, right? You've got multiple data centers, East Coast, West Coast, or, cloud on-prem, and sort of what does it take to make this work? And then, how do you test it, right? Is it reliable when you actually go through and test it? And what are the pains to actually go through and test it? And the biggest takeaway that I want to take from today is that business continuity goes a lot further than just backup or disaster recovery or high availability. It really is all three when you think about it, right? That high availability is that primary site where you've got a failover for your application or your ERP or whatever that happens to be. You've got your secondary site, so if that main site goes down, and then believe it or not, yeah, we still need backups, right? Because that's file level, data gets corrupted. I mean, these things happen all the time. Somebody deletes something by accident. How do we recover that? I mean, it's always an interesting challenge from the IT perspective on, trying to know what users are going to do to throw a wrench in your plans for continuity. And really, it's a three-phase approach, right? So why is DR important, right? Adam Savage from Mythbusters is a pretty popular show among the tech community, but failure is always an option. When we talk about some of the basics of resiliency, there are some myths, right? But fact of the matter is, software has bugs, hardware will fail, and humans will make mistakes. I thought this is a kind of a funny picture, is that you can see that both your power supplies are online here, and the one on the right-hand side was not locked in tight properly. And so how hard would it be for that to come offline, rattle loose with all the vibrations and everything happening inside of that cabinet space, and that's a human failure, right? And these things, they happen all the time. So when we talk about a differentiator between disaster recovery and high availability, it's really that disaster recovery begins where the high availability ends, right? So when you build your high availability space so that you're protected at that same local area when your server goes down or something like that, now you need to figure out what happens if that whole site goes down. Happens to us all the time, even if you're in the cloud, right? So even if you're in Azure East 2, it's a very good practice to have a secondary site for those mission critical applications and workloads. So disaster recovery begins where high availability ends. And what we're talking about here is you've got your application, right? And think of this as your layers. You've got your cluster that's wrapped around that server, that application, that's giving you that high availability, so you can fail over to another server if there's a software problem or patching problem or whatever. Now you've got a secondary site that's failing over for DR, right? And depending on the terminology, however you're looking at this, whether it be local on-prem or if we're looking at something spanning across all of, all of the world, all of the US, whatever it happens to be, really it's all three that help your business stay online and bringing that continuity. And Azure's bringing some really interesting offerings to help with this, right? So just real quick, what we talk about, in the backup world is RTO and RPO. So essentially, how much data can you afford to lose and how much downtime can you afford, right? Once you figure that out, then you get PTO, because when you recover from a backup, it's a nightmare, right? And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. It's a little cheesy, but there's a lot of truth in that for anybody who's been up till 3 in the morning recovering from a backup. When you talk about RT and RPO, it's a business decision, guys, right? It's not something that IT thinks is the answer, because believe it or not, we don't have all the answers, right? It's going to your CFO. It's going to those business leaders that can really dictate how long these events can be. Basically, how long can you take that for, right? If you lose a half day's worth of work, is it going to be 10,000 transactions, or is it going to be 5 transactions, right? It's definitely something that needs to be kind of talked through. And if you've got a CFO like I had, and he pushes back and says, that's not for me to decide, that's for you to decide, then you need to talk to somebody else and get the right people in the room to make sure that you're implementing this properly. So how is Azure helping with HA, right? First of all, you've got availability sets, right? And this is a concept of fault domains and update domains. And when you think about it, right, your fault domains are essentially your server rack, right? So now you're spanning across multiple racks with multiple fault domains, and then your update domains are happening within that rack. So when you use an availability set, you've got the ability to go across fault domains and update domains, which allows you essentially having that resiliency that you need for your virtual machines or whatever those workloads are in the availability set. How does Azure help with DR, right? So we're going to kind of go through some of these a little bit quick, but you know, there are definitely a lot of different ways to approach and address this. And the first one is Azure Site Recovery, right? We'll go a little deeper on this in a little bit here, but essentially, you know, any cloud, site to site, site to Azure, you know, Linux and Windows OSs, Hyper-V, VMware, and you know, on-prem, you know, standalone servers. They can all be backed up using site recovery. It's a very simple tool to set up. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now we'll talk about the concept of Recovery Services Vault, right? So really, this is where you are storing all your backups and your recovery points, and it works nicely within the Azure space to keep those files protected, and you can set policies along how long you keep them, and you know, all that fun stuff. So the nice thing is that they're application consistent backups for Azure VMs, and then they're file consistent backups for Linux Azure VMs, right? So we're talking about the Azure world here, but then you can also use your Vault for your on-premises deployments as well. You know, so really when you think about those vaults, what are those decisions you need to make, right? Is how many vaults are you going to need? Where is the location of those vaults? And what is your storage replication type? Okay, so you'll want to basically think about those as you're doing some of the planning and starting to deploy some of these technologies. Azure Backup is something that's seemingly a little unknown, but what's being offered here is actually pretty impressive, right? So over 100 petabytes in Azure Backup storage today, and these are customers' backups, right? 3 petabytes are added every week. These are petabytes. Think about how large that is, right? 200,000 IaaS VMs are being backed up into Azure Backup, right? 85% of all Azure top customers are using Azure Backup, right? Just because it's almost seamless when you're talking about backing up your IaaS VMs and other services, right? 195,000 on-premises servers are protected. And these numbers are a little bit old, so I'm sure the numbers are much higher by now, right? But just an idea of scale, you know, 60,000 customers are using it. Seems like a pretty big offering that a lot of people don't really know about. When we talk about the conventional backup approaches, right, you've got your on-prem, your in-cloud VMs and your storage and your SQL, right? So you write a custom script to basically back these up, and they get stored into Azure storage. You know, you've got your SQL native backups, your VM snapshots, and your file snapshots. Problem is that you've got that infrastructure that you need to manage, and there's no centralized management. So you're kind of doing these as one-off, right? And if you've got a small shop and that's reasonable, then, you know, keep doing what you're doing as long as you're confident in that plan. You know, another approach is having a backup software running on a server somewhere or a VM somewhere. You know, concentrating all of those backups, you know, basically bringing everything into one place and then pushing it off into Azure storage. Again, you've got some central management, so you're, you know, coordinating all those backups through one local place, but you still need to manage that infrastructure, right? When we start talking about Azure Backup, now you've got the ability to take away that infrastructure, right? you're using Azure Backup Services, so you can scale very quickly and easily. It extends out to many different things. You've got that centralized management now, and those servers are being backed up directly to Azure, and you're managing them all from one place. And it kind of gives some of the overview of what's available here with recovery point management, storage management, data pruning, data packing. And then you get into some of the authentication pieces, right? And who has access to this, and who can see the reporting, and how do you know that your backups are succeeding? Then that turns around to restore as a service, right? So this concept, everything is becoming as a service, DR as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, right? Now we've got restore as a service, where essentially you're taking those backups and you're able to deploy the elements that you need to restore very quickly and easily. And before you do the full restore, you've got that opportunity to scan through and make sure it's what you want to restore, right? Who's ever gone through, this is a typical scenario where you figure out what your recovery point was and where you're storing it from, and then you pull down that data, right? And this is just this is using somewhat more of the Hyper-V type scenario where you're restoring a full virtual machine, right? In order to see if it's what you want, you've got to go through the whole process of restoring it all, and then you can finally restore what was missing or what was deleted, or however that works. Whereas with sort of this newer approach, right, you can more quickly spin up what is being restored. You can connect to it because it's sitting somewhere in a vault, right? And now you can go through and figure out what needs to be restored. So if it's a small file, it's very, very quick to restore that, right? Because you're mounting that recovery point, and you can go through and pull off what you need, as opposed to having to restore that entire machine first, right? So when we look at the impact of that, now your time to restore is much, much quicker. And this is just a scale, right, to look at what the typical recovery time would be based on the storage size. So, if you're restoring a terabyte drive, and the only way to access it is to restore the entire drive first and then go and pull the data off, that's a really painful process. And the worst is when you restore the whole thing and it's not what you needed, or it doesn't have what you needed. I'm sure that you guys have been down this road, as I know I have many times, and it can be really, really challenging and really, really frustrating, right? So let's talk about sending large data efficiently, right? So now if you want to start using Azure Backup, you can back up your data. You can use an agent backup, which, basically entails some compression, so that makes it quicker to pass across the wire. Then you push it into some kind of an offline seeding, right? So and it's all BitLocker encrypted, so you're safe, and then you ship that to the Azure import service, right? So you ship it to Microsoft, and they take it and they import that right into your recovery services vault. And then, this is for your first backup, and then basically any subsequent backups are going to be incremental or differential, or however you set that up, and it's a much quicker process to pull that data across, right? To take it one step further, they give you the Azure Data Box, right, which is up to 100 terabytes of data. They'll ship you this box. You connect it to your local environment or your data center, and pull the data off, put it onto the data box, and it uses the same ingestion process where you bring it in and you pull this data across. And they have different size boxes depending on how much data you need to move. So definitely a great option for getting started with Azure Backup and moving those large sums of data to start. So how does the data actually move during an offline backup, right? So what does that process look like? So you're on-prem, you want to back up your data, you're going to back it up to your local drive, which is a staging location. Then that's going to move it over to the hard drive, so up to 10 terabytes for a disk, or when we talk about the data box, you back it up move it over to the drive, right? And then from there, you're going to ship it. You're going to send it to the Azure import service. It's going to write that to blob storage. Again, this is still all encrypted throughout this process because blob storage enables encryption by default. And then you pass it off to their Azure Recovery Services Vault. And then you can pull off whatever you need from there. And then you would continue with your additional backups over to that same service as you move along. And Microsoft knows that the leader in virtual machine technology is VMware, and so they've deployed a lot of these so that you can deploy these services directly into your VMware environment using vCenter. It's using some older versions even that allows you to back up those VMs directly. And then in a minute, we'll see how you can do the same thing with recovery services, where you can back up your virtual machines directly and do replication over to the cloud. So taking it one step further beyond Azure Backup, now you have Azure Backup Server, right? So Microsoft Azure Backup Server is designed to address the protection of data and the workload level, right? So the difference that you'll see here is that essentially the backup server is now going to allow you to back up specific applications, right? So it's going to be able to handle all of your SharePoint, Exchange, and SQL workloads, right? You can back up VMware, Hyper-V, or physical servers up into Azure, right? And it all basically works through an agent on those servers and passes up the data up into your Azure Backup Server. It works alongside with System Center Data Protection Manager, right? It'll pass the short-term backups to disk storage locally, and then it'll pass the rest up into the cloud, all secured and encrypted. And then the same thing where you can restore back from the cloud into a staging folder, restore back to your initial destination, right? So the Azure Backup Server is allowing you to pick up where the Azure Backup Service leaves off because it is not application aware. But it gives you that sort of true hybrid approach where Microsoft understands that in today's day and age, we have a true hybrid approach for a lot of customers due to the fact that we need to be able to stay on-prem for whatever reason. So if the requirement is for regulatory purposes, or we don't want to put PII data in the cloud, whatever that reason is, now you've still got some ability to use both cloud and prem, so long as it meets your requirements internally. Now we talk about site recovery, right? Essentially, it gives you the ability to migrate applications to Azure IaaS with confidence, right? So there's zero application data loss during a migration, right? So you're essentially spinning up a recovery services vault. You are, depending on your particular environment, you can install it directly into VMware vCenter. You can install an agent onto a physical server. You can install an agent onto a VMware ESXi server. So if you're not running vCenter and you're only running the naked hypervisor, you can still install that on the VM as though it were an on-prem server, and then it also can work with Hyper-V as well. There's near zero application downtime during that migration, right? So if you need to fail over to that secondary site, it's a very, very quick where you left off, and it's depending on your RTO and RPO. You set those settings and determine how much data loss is acceptable. And it will spin up as soon as it detects that you're having an issue, right? It gives you a broad coverage of applications, OS, a lot of Azure features in there, and there's no application, no impact application testing in Azure. So if you want to spin up your recovery services environment, you can do this without impacting your local environment. So you can do a test of your DR or BC plan, and you can do it in such a way that it doesn't cause interruption in your current environment, and you can go ahead and test through and test those workloads, whatever that happens to be. And the best part is that in order to run the service, it is free, right? When you start spinning up those workloads, that's when you start paying for it, or as you start to, incur those backups, right? So it's going to cost money for the storage, but as we know, the storage is the cheapest part of all these online cloud providers. So just to give sort of an overview of the things that we can back up here, right? So you've got Hyper-V to Hyper-V, Hyper-V to Hyper-V with replication over a SAN, so all on-prem, Hyper-V to Azure, VMware or physical to VMware, right? So you can use this as your VMware replication tool as well. And as you go into the Azure portal and set this up, it gives you those options. And where do you want to start from and where do you want to go to? VMware or physical to Azure, Azure to Azure. So if you want to use this as a replication for your IaaS VMs in one region, you want to replicate them over to, from east to west or, east to Asia, east to Europe, whatever, you've got that capability to be able to go from region to region. So the way it works in Hyper-V, right? So you've got your Hyper-V source, you set up the data channel, it's just 443 traffic going across, using a public internet or express route. The Microsoft Recovery Services agent is installed on your Hyper-V cluster. Data gets pushed over, right? Depending on the size and how much backup there is, how many servers you're backing up, express route might be the best way to do this, but there are obviously options, different ways you can do it. We talk about for VMware, again, this is for VMware, AWS, or physical servers. It's the same thing. You're passing over through 443 with Azure Site Recovery. All right, you install your process server and your configuration server in your local environment, and this becomes, environment aware of the servers that are running to be able to basically prepare them and stage them to pass them over. And you back up your servers over the cloud again. When we look at it from DR, application DR specific area, it's basically server to, Azure storage, right? So you're backing up that data over to your Azure storage, and then if you need to spin those up at a later time, you can build those VMs as required. You don't have to have that in place ahead of time, and it depends on, again, what your strategy is. Are you okay with your recovery time being a day? Some places are because they don't do a ton of transactions, or whatever the reason, they're a smaller shop and they don't want to have to pay to have that environment up and running all the time. This is certainly a strategy. It's kind of like a hybrid backup scenario where you're pushing the image of the VM over to Azure, but you're not building out that architecture just yet. And then you've got more application aware DR, right? So you've got your database peer, and you can use it to set up your availability group, right, across a VPN. So, if you're running SQL 2016, always on availability groups, you can have an IaaS VM set up so that you can, basically set up that IaaS VM as a node for your SQL availability group, and then other applications here as well. So moving along to Azure Migrate, right? This is one of the newer offerings from Microsoft. It's come out, in just over, I don't know, about 2 months ago, I want to say. And basically the idea here was to make it easier for customers to migrate to Azure, right? So what is the process? You discover what you want to migrate, and you migrate it, and then you optimize it in the cloud, right? And what are we talking about when we're migrating? We're migrating virtual machines, applications, databases, all that kind of stuff, right? And oh, by the way, a customer doesn't want to have to pay for it if they're doing this assessment, right? So they want to run it in their own environment. They don't want to, they want to learn it themselves. They want to go through it all themselves. And so they want basically to do it themselves, and they don't want to have to pay for a tool for it, right? So the way that this was done in the past is that you would run the maps tool, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, that would go through and it would run in your environment, and basically it would capture all the environment details, how much RAM, how much CPU, how much disk space, all those kinds of things, right? And then there were some partners that had their own ways to approach it, right? and you would use the site recovery or database migration services to move databases over, and you would use some of these other partners like Zerto or Veeam in order to compress and very quickly move that stuff over the wire to get it over there, and then you'd optimize it with Cloud In and OMS and Docker, all those. So today they brought out Azure Migrate. Now, this, like I said, this came out a couple of months ago, and if you haven't played with it, haven't used it, essentially in your vCenter environment, you can deploy a VM. It's about a 10 gig download, and it collects information about your environment, and it essentially works through and it spits out a whole report as to what is happening. And you still have the partners that do this, and you have the partners that can help you discover, migrate, and now optimize, right? Down the road, the goal is going to be to have Azure Migrate do that whole service for you, right? So they're going to this point where Azure Migrate can go in and discover your environment, figure out what needs to be moved, migrate that data over for you all in one clean step, and then clean up and make sure that you're not over provisioning servers or what other cost considerations there are. There's a lot of them when it comes to building your proper environment. So some of the benefits, right, are the discovery phase, right? You've got 3 different approaches. You've got the appliance-based, which, as I mentioned, you can install that VM in your vCenter. You can do a lighter approach, which is really just using the Windows Management Foundation service, and then you've got the a deeper approach where you get high confidence, everything that's running. It gives you a deep amount of information, right? The assessment itself is basically going through and making sure that Azure is the right answer for you, right? And in some cases, it may cost you more in Azure, and so they're going to give you what those cost estimations are up front, and tell you if it makes sense to wait until you need to move these workloads, and it's going to give you what you need for the proper VMs that you're going to deploy. So when we talk about the appliance-based, right, you don't have to configure a machine or do anything like that. All you have to do is deploy this this VM, click a couple of buttons, say I agree, and it's going to start running in your VMware environment and capture all that information. When we talk about the light discovery approach, it doesn't require an agent, and you don't have to open up any firewall ports. Now, mind you, there are some requirements around the OS. I believe that if you're running Windows 2012 R2 and later, this is done by default. But if you're running 2012, then you need to install an agent. It's the Windows Management Framework. There are no machine credentials required. You don't have to, open up any additional ports or anything like that, because it's all working inside the Microsoft Management Foundation there. And then we go into the deep discovery, is that, there may be instances where you need better knowledge about those machines, so you would install an agent, and it's going to collect the information that way. And it's not making any assumptions. It's looking exactly what's running all the time, and then you can deploy it through those means, right? And it's going to say, okay, can I host this machine in Azure, right? It's going to answer these questions. What is the best VM size based on my performance? So if I leave this running in my environment for a week, it's going to give me a recommendation based on what that VM is that I should be running. Okay, what grade or scale of VM, and how much CPU versus processor versus storage, and it's going to make recommendations, and they're real recommendations. It's not trying to sell you something that you don't need, right? And then what would the recurring costs be? It's going to tell you exactly what it's going to cost to deploy this in Azure, which is a really helpful thing, because it sets up numbers for budgeting, and it really helps customers understand, what do they need? What are their costs going to be from a budgetary standpoint, right? So how does it work, right? So I'm a user and I have my vCenter server with all my ESXi hosts and VMs here deployed. I'm going to download and configure the appliance, right? So basically you go out, you start a recovery services project, you download the appliance and you deploy it to your vCenter server. And the configuration that they mention here is literally just turning it on, hitting accept, and letting it go through its setup and start running in the environment. So it's not a heavy configuration by any means. So my collector VM starts running and starts running the discovery in the background, and it's passing the raw metadata to the collector VM. And like I said, this is all running in the background. It's capturing all the information about your environment. It's pushing that up to the Azure Migrate service, so it knows what you're running in the background. It collects that information, and then it pushes all that information over to the Migrate portal. Then it passes, it allows you to create that assessment, right? And it gives you an understanding of what the ROI is and how much you can plan to spend per month, and what the what the ultimate expenditure is going to be, so you can break down and do your cost analysis, or TCO, if you will, to compare the two. And basically, to sum things up, when we talk about DR as a service, right, it really is everywhere. So it's not in every single region, but it's in the vast majority of the regions. And so, you've got this capability to deploy from your local, whatever your local region is, or whatever region you use predominantly, you can then run your DR to another region in many across the world. So that sums up what I've got for today. Liz, I don't know if we have any questions. I went through a little faster than I expected to, but
We don't yet, so I'll give everybody just a couple minutes maybe to see if some come
sure.
through. Oh, here's one that I missed. Last time I checked, Azure Site Recovery supports only failover but not failback for on-prem Hyper-V. Has that changed or still no failback ability?
There is still no failback. That has not changed. You've got the ability to run it in an Azure VM when you need to, run that server. So I think the recommendation there is, keep it running until you can restore that on-prem server back to where you need to be. Do a local backup of that IaaS VM, or do a backup of that VM with the information that you need to be restored back to that on-prem server.
Is there a typical RTO and RPO range where you recommend using ASR for the database tier disaster recovery rather than using availability groups?
It really depends on the business, right? So it depends on what the business requirements are. It depends on the volume. That could be a whole hour-long conversation to discuss what the requirements are there. And it's kind of hard to answer with no real details. So.
All right. Does this DR service work for both IS and PAS apps?
No, this is for IaaS only. So the DR as a service would be basically failing over, one of your VMs, either as an IaaS VM over to a different region. The PaaS server offerings, you'd have to look at what kind of PaaS services very dependent on what the actual service it is for what there are for DR offerings. So, when the true disaster recovery, sort of, can you fail over to a different region, or, are you just taking backups and spinning it up in a different region, or how that works? It's very specific to the PaaS offering itself.
Any Azure integrations with VM to speak of?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I think it's VM, VEEAM.
Oh, Veeam.
Veeam. There you go.
Yep, sure, yeah. So it is considered one of the partners for Microsoft as you do that migration. So you can specify what your target is, depending on the version of Veeam. I'm pretty sure, I want to say it's version 8 and later. It's been a little while since I played with it, but I want to say it's version 8 and later allows you to back up into Azure and put it up into that environment. Be best to contact Veeam support to get the specific information about it, though. I know there is some partnership there.
Will you be able to provide an active-active situation using Azure with a physical VM?
No, it's not designed for that, right? So if you're going from prem to cloud, it wouldn't be considered active-active because yeah, no, I mean, it would be, a very, very short RTO, RPO if you need to fail over to that cloud resource, but you don't have that capability yet in site recovery.
Okay. Oh, and then in response to your question, they said, how about strictly using Azure?
For that same?
Yes.
No, it's still, it wouldn't be the same. Trying to wrap my head around how you would set that up. I think you'd probably do it in the same way that you would set up Windows clusters to have an active-active. Have to look at that specifically, but I think that's how you'd have to do it. I don't think you could use site recovery for that.
What would you recommend to get started in convincing management?
So depending on the environment, right? So you've got, if you're running in VMware, it makes it very easy because you can just deploy this, this collector, if you will, for free. It sits in your environment, and it gives you the ability to go in and basically measure everything that's happening while you're, running. And I definitely recommend running it for a couple of weeks so that it's capturing, peaks and valleys of the resources. But it's going to capture everything that's in your environment for free, and it's going to give you a full report as to what what you can expect your cloud resources to cost, right? Some of the arguments that we get around Azure and cloud and things like that are around, privacy and security and things like that. One of the biggest selling points that I can make when it comes to Azure is that Microsoft spends over $1 billion a year on security alone. Now, they're also probably one of the biggest companies that gets attacked, right? And they've got a huge surface. I mean, the largest software company in the world. But where you can get in there and play around with this for free makes a really good selling point. And the report that comes from it is very, very intuitive. It helps you to understand what's going on in your environment, and it really gives you an idea of what it'll cost to run that same environment. And so when it comes time to buy new software, buy new servers, re-up your enterprise agreement for your Windows licenses, whatever it happens to be, that's usually the best time to jump, because you can say, well, I can replicate this over to Azure, spin it all up and, take it down as I need to. Did I lose you, Liz?
Oh, nope, sorry. I was on mute. All right. Well, it looks like that's all the questions. We do have normal ones. Yes, Chris will provide the slides for this. We always link them in a follow-up blog, usually within about a week or so. So I recommend following our blog. It's blog.pragmaticworks.com. As always, this session was recorded, so you all will receive a link tomorrow in an email from the GoToWebinar platform with a link to that recording. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us at any time, and we'll pass your information along to Chris. And we hope you all have a very good 4th of July and stay fun and safe, and we will see you on the next session. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, guys.